Alex Rivera had approximately 30 seconds to figure out what he'd done wrong before he'd have to face an alien queen's fury in front of 400 witnesses. The problem was, he genuinely had no idea. Lieutenant Rivera this way, quickly. The Velthine security officer, tall, with those characteristic long ears held in a position that Alex's cultural database unhelpfully labeled as urgent concern, gestured sharply toward a door marked with symbols Alex couldn't read. "Can you at least tell me what this is about?" Alex tried for the fourth time since they'd appeared in the commissary and politely, but firmly extracted him from his lunch. "Her Majesty will explain," the officer said, which was the same non-answer he'd been giving for the past 10 minutes. They'd walked from the commissary through increasingly formal sections of the Celestial Concordance Station, from the casual dining areas where off-duty personnel grabbed meals, through administrative corridors where actual diplomatic work happened, into the ceremonial wings where the important people conducted important business. Alex was not an important person. He was a logistics coordinator for the Terran Diplomatic Corps, which was a fancy way of saying he made sure supplies arrived where they needed to be and that paperwork got filed in the correct databases. He'd been on the station for 6 months, part of the human delegation support staff, not senior enough to attend formal sessions, not important enough to brief ambassadors, just competent enough to keep things running smoothly in the background. He'd never met Queen Isara of the Velthine Empire, had never been in the same room as her, had certainly never done anything that would warrant being summoned to her presence with the kind of urgency usually reserved for security threats or diplomatic emergencies. "Through here," the security officer said, opening a door into a small antechamber. Inside, another Velthine officer was waiting, this one with ears held in a position that suggested formal protocol mode engaged. "Lieutenant Alex Rivera, Terran Diplomatic Corps," the first officer announced. The second officer looked Alex up and down with an expression that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. It was hard to tell with Velthine facial expressions. "Her Majesty has summoned you to appear before the Grand Assembly," the second officer said. "You will be escorted to the hall. When called, you will approach the dais. You will speak only if directly addressed by Her Majesty. You will show appropriate deference at all times." "I understand protocol," Alex said, because he did. He'd been through the diplomatic corps training even if he'd never expected to use the formal audience portions. "But can someone please tell me what this is about? Did I make a shipping error, file something incorrectly, violate some regulation I don't know about?" The two officers exchanged glances. "Her Majesty is displeased," the second officer said carefully. "She has interrupted the assembly session to demand your presence. That is all we know." Displeased. That was a diplomatic way of saying furious, and Alex's stomach dropped. Through the walls, he could hear the muffled sounds of a large gathering, hundreds of voices, the particular acoustics of a vast space filled with beings trying to maintain dignified silence. "Is this where I find out I'm being deported?" Alex asked, trying for humor and achieving something closer to panic. "Because if I violated some major protocol, I'd really appreciate a heads-up before I get publicly denounced." "You will understand when Her Majesty speaks," the first officer said, which was completely unhelpful. A chime sounded soft but unmistakable. "That is your summons," the second officer said. "The doors will open. You will enter. You will proceed directly down the central aisle to the dais. Do not stop. Do not speak to anyone. Eyes forward, posture respectful." "Right. Don't embarrass humanity, got it." Alex took a deep breath, tried to calm his racing heart, and wondered what possible sequence of events had led to this moment. The doors opened, and he got his first look at the Grand Assembly Hall. It was massive, designed to accommodate hundreds of beings from dozens of different species, with tiered seating rising on both sides of a central aisle that led to a raised dais at the far end. And every single being in that hall was looking at him. Alex recognized faces in the crowd, Ambassador Chen from the Terran delegation, looking as confused as Alex felt. Several Valorian representatives, whose metallic skin was showing agitated bronze tones. A Crithian warlord whose storm cloud substance was crackling with what might have been curiosity. Delegates from the coalition of Outer Rim worlds, from the Nethran sovereignty, from powers Alex couldn't immediately identify. All of them watching him walk down that aisle like he was heading to his own execution. His feet started moving on autopilot, one step, then another, maintaining the steady, dignified pace that formal protocol demanded even when every instinct was screaming at him to either run away or demand answers. The dais loomed ahead, and on it sat Queen Isara. She was exactly as imposing as every image and briefing had suggested, tall, even-seated, with robes that shifted from deep blue to silver in the light, and those long, elegant ears held in a position that Alex's cultural database was now absolutely certain meant visible anger. Her expression was controlled, but barely, like someone maintaining perfect composure through sheer force of will while fury burned just beneath the surface. Alex reached the base of the dais and stopped, unsure whether he should climb the steps or wait for instruction. "Come forward, Lieutenant Rivera," Queen Isara said, her voice carrying across the silent hall with perfect clarity. Alex climbed the steps. There were 7 of them, he counted automatically, until he stood on the level just below the throne, where the Queen's closest advisors were positioned. Those advisors were all looking at him with expressions he couldn't read, but several of them seemed uncomfortable in a way that suggested they knew something he didn't. Queen Isara stood, which caused a ripple through the entire assembly, beings rising respectfully, others leaning forward with increased attention. She looked down at Alex, and her ears shifted into a new position that his database frantically labeled as controlled fury about to become uncontrolled. "Do you know why you are here, Lieutenant Rivera?" she asked. "No, Your Majesty." Alex's voice came out steadier than he felt. "I apologize if I have caused offense or violated any protocols. Any error was unintentional, and I'm prepared to make appropriate amends." The Queen studied him for a long moment. "You have no idea what you've done," she said. It wasn't quite a question, but Alex answered anyway. "No, Your Majesty." "Interesting." She turned to address the full assembly, her voice taking on the formal weight of ceremonial pronouncement. "6 weeks ago," she began, "this assembly debated the Outer Territories Relief Act, a humanitarian measure designed to provide aid to colony worlds affected by recent conflicts." Alex remembered that debate vaguely. It had been in the daily briefings, though he hadn't paid close attention since it didn't directly affect his work. "The proposal was contentious," the Queen continued. "Resources were limited. Some argued that aid should be conditional, tied to political alignment, distributed according to strategic value rather than need." Her ears shifted slightly forward, a position that Alex's database suggested meant approaching the important part. "The version that ultimately passed," Queen Isara said, "included what were called alignment provisions. Colony worlds whose governments had failed to formally ally with any major power would be excluded from aid distribution. 3 worlds fell into that category: Viridian 3, New Corsica, and Haven's Gate." She paused, and her voice dropped to something colder. "Approximately 800,000 civilians live on those 3 worlds, mostly refugees from various conflicts. Populations with no formal government, no political leverage, no voice in these halls. The exclusion meant they would receive no food shipments, no medical supplies, no infrastructure support." The assembly was completely silent. "Those worlds were facing famine conditions," the Queen said. "The exclusion was effectively a death sentence delivered through bureaucratic language." Alex's stomach started to sink for reasons he couldn't yet articulate, but a terrible suspicion was forming. "The Relief Act went into effect 4 weeks ago," Queen Isara continued. "Aid distribution began according to the approved provisions. Supplies were allocated to aligned colonies. The three excluded worlds received nothing. Her gaze returned to Alex, and he felt his face go cold. Or they would have received nothing, she amended, except that 3 days before implementation, someone altered the shipping manifests. Oh no. Food shipments that were supposed to remain in central storage were quietly redirected to Veridian 3, the Queen said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Medical equipment designated for Allied colonies was duplicated in requisition orders, with the extras sent to New Corsica. Infrastructure components were reclassified as surplus and shipped to Haven's Gate. She was looking directly at him now, and Alex couldn't breathe. Someone with access to logistical systems, Queen Asara continued, and the technical knowledge to make those changes appear as routine administrative corrections rather than policy violations. Someone who apparently decided that bureaucratic language and political calculations were less important than 800,000 people not starving to death. The entire assembly had turned to look at Alex, and he stood frozen under the weight of hundreds of stares. "I discovered these alterations 3 days ago," the Queen said, "when my intelligence service, which monitors humanitarian supply movements as part of security protocols, noticed discrepancies between official Relief Act provisions and actual distribution patterns." She descended 1 step, closer to Alex, her fury now visible in every line of her posture. "I was furious," she said simply. Alex wanted to explain, to defend himself, to say something, but his voice had stopped working. "I was furious," Queen Asara repeated, "and I summoned you here to explain exactly why." She turned back to the assembly, and Alex realized with growing shock that her fury wasn't directed at him at all. "I was furious," the Queen said, her voice rising with controlled anger, "that such an alteration had been necessary. That someone, a junior logistics officer with no political authority and no protection from consequences, felt compelled to circumvent official policy because that policy was morally bankrupt." Her ears were fully forward now, in what Alex's database finally identified as anger directed at specific target that is not you. "I was furious," she continued, "that this assembly, containing some of the most powerful beings in known space, debated the value of 800,000 lives according to political alignment. That we sat in comfortable chambers and decided those civilians were acceptable casualties in service of diplomatic positioning." She gestured at her own advisors, and several of them visibly flinched. "I was furious that none of my advisors mentioned this consequence when they presented the Relief Act for my endorsement. That they treated the exclusion of 3 worlds as routine political compromise rather than mass death by administrative decision." The hall had erupted into whispers, shocked murmurs, the sound of hundreds of beings processing what they were hearing. "I was furious," Queen Asara said, and her voice cut through the noise like a blade, "that a human with no rank, no authority, and no political protection did what rulers should do, chose morality over convenience, while those of us with actual power made calculated decisions about acceptable casualties." She looked at Alex, and her expression softened slightly, though her ears remained in that forward aggressive position. "Lieutenant Rivera," she said, "you altered those shipping manifests. Is that correct?" Alex's mouth was dry, but he managed to answer. "Yes, Your Majesty. Did you expect recognition? Did you plan to claim credit for saving 800,000 lives?" "No, Your Majesty, I couldn't let it stand. The exclusion was wrong. Those people needed help, and we had supplies. I thought if I was quiet about it, if I made it look like routine corrections, maybe no one would notice and the aid would get where it needed to be. And if you had been caught before the supplies were distributed, I would have accepted the consequences, Your Majesty. Getting fired seemed less important than people eating." The Queen's expression shifted into something that might have been approval, though her fury was still evident. "You made a choice," she said. "That should never have been necessary. You did the work of governance that those who actually govern failed to do." She turned back to the assembly, and her voice took on ceremonial weight. This is the standard I should hold myself to, not political calculation, not strategic positioning, not careful weighing of competing interests, but the simple moral clarity of people are dying and I have the power to help them. She paused, letting her words sink in. Lieutenant Rivera acted as a ruler should, Queen Isara said. He saw wrong, had power to correct it, and did so without seeking glory. He chose principle over protocol. He prioritized lives over political convenience. He risked everything to do the right thing. Her gaze swept across her own court, her advisors, the assembled delegates. How many of us in positions of power can say the same? She asked. How many of us would sacrifice our careers, our carefully maintained neutrality, our political positioning to save 800,000 people we'll never meet? No one answered. I summoned Lieutenant Rivera here, the Queen said, not to punish him though he violated protocols, not to condemn him though he exceeded his authority. I summoned him to make absolutely clear to this assembly, to my court, to everyone watching, that his actions represent the standard I expect from those who govern in my name. She descended the final steps until she stood on the same level as Alex, looking him directly in the eye. Your words have left me speechless, Your Majesty, Alex managed to say, because it was true. He'd expected punishment and received something he couldn't begin to process. Good, Queen Isara said, because now I have more words to say, and I need you to listen carefully. She turned to address the full assembly one more time, and Alex stood beside her, still trying to understand how saving people from starvation had turned into this moment. This human will be offered a position in my government, the Queen announced, and the hall erupted in shock. The noise in the Grand Assembly Hall was immediate and cacophonous, shocked exclamations in a dozen languages, delegates rising to their feet, advisors frantically conferring, the careful diplomatic atmosphere shattering into chaos. Queen Isara waited for exactly 10 seconds, then raised one hand. Silence fell like a guillotine. Lieutenant Rivera will be offered a position as humanitarian logistics advisor, she continued as if there had been no interruption. Reporting directly to my office, with authority to override bureaucratic obstacles when civilian welfare is at stake, with protection from political retaliation, with a mandate to ensure that my government never again creates policy that condemns civilians to death through administrative language. One of her advisors, an elderly Velthine whose ears had gone flat against his head in what looked like horror, leaned forward. Your Majesty, such a position has never existed. The implications for our governmental structure will be significant, the Queen interrupted. That is the point, Chief Advisor Kelrin. If our governmental structure creates policy that requires junior logistics officers to commit insubordination to prevent mass death, then our structure requires change. She looked at Alex. You may decline, of course. You have served your own government well. But the offer stands, and it stands publicly, so everyone understands what I value in those who serve in my name. Alex's brain was still trying to catch up with events. Join the Velthine government. Leave the Terran diplomatic corps. Completely upend his life because he'd made one decision that seemed obviously right at the time. Your Majesty, he started, then stopped because he genuinely didn't know what to say. You have questions, the Queen said. Ask them. Why me? There are people with far more experience in humanitarian work, with actual credentials, with the political awareness to know when breaking rules might endanger their careers. The Queen interrupted. With the diplomatic training that teaches them to defer difficult moral choices to those with greater authority. With the professional distance that allows them to treat 800,000 deaths as acceptable casualties. Her ears shifted slightly. I don't want experienced advisors who know how to navigate political complexity while civilians starve. I want someone who looks at wrong and fixes it without calculating the personal cost. That person is you. From the Terran delegation section, Ambassador Chen rose to his feet. Your Majesty, if I may, Lieutenant Rivera is currently serving in the Terran Diplomatic Corps. His actions, while Chen paused, clearly choosing words carefully, while well-intentioned, did violate Corps regulations. We would need to address that before any transfer of employment could be considered. Will you punish him for saving lives? Queen Isara asked sharply. We will need to review the circumstances, Chen said. He acted outside his authority, violated supply chain protocols, and falsified official documents. To prevent mass starvation, the Queen interrupted. Say the full sentence, Ambassador. He violated regulations to prevent mass starvation. Does that context matter to the Terran Alliance, or are rules more important than lives? Chen's expression tightened. Your Majesty, regulations exist for reasons. If every officer decided to personally override policy they disagreed with, the entire system would collapse into chaos. Then perhaps, the Queen said coldly, your system should create policies worth following. If your official procedures produce outcomes so morally reprehensible that good people must violate them to preserve their conscience, the problem is your procedures, not the people who break them. She descended another step, now standing fully among the assembled delegates rather than elevated above them. I am not suggesting anarchy, she continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. I am not advocating that every individual substitute their judgment for established authority. But I am saying, clearly, publicly, without ambiguity, that when established authority creates policy that condemns 800,000 civilians to death, the person who prevents that death deserves recognition, not punishment. A Valorian delegate stood, his metallic skin showing agitated bronze tones. Your Majesty, with respect, the Relief Act was the result of careful negotiation between multiple powers. The exclusion provisions were necessary compromises to secure broader support for the humanitarian mission. Without those compromises, no aid would have been distributed at all. So you sacrificed 3 worlds to save others, the Queen said. You decided that some lives matter less based on political alignment. You made calculated choices about acceptable casualties. And you call this humanitarian work. Her ears were fully forward now, aggressive and unmistakable. Tell me, Ambassador, she said, when you negotiated these necessary compromises, did you visit Veridian 3? Did you speak to the refugees there? Did you look at parents trying to feed hungry children and explain that your political interests required their deaths? The Valorian delegate's bronze tones deepened, darkening towards something that might have been shame. I thought not, the Queen said. It's easier to compromise lives you'll never meet, easier to create exclusion provisions when you don't have to see the faces of those you're excluding. She turned in a slow circle, addressing the entire assembly. How many beings in this hall have ever visited a colony world during famine? She asked. How many have held a child dying from malnutrition? How many have watched medical facilities fail because supplies were delayed by political negotiations? The silence was profound. We govern from comfortable chambers, Queen Isara said. We debate policy in climate-controlled halls while people die in ways we never witness. We create language, exclusion provisions, necessary compromises, strategic alignment priorities that obscures the reality of what we're discussing, choosing who lives and who dies based on political calculation. She returned to stand beside Alex, and he realized she was positioning him deliberately, not as someone being addressed, but as someone standing with her beside her. This human, she said, gesturing at Alex, didn't have the luxury of political language or diplomatic distance. He saw the raw reality. 800,000 people would starve because of policy this assembly created. And he chose, without authority, without protection, without expectation of reward, to fix that problem using the only power he had. He committed fraud, someone called out from the assembly. Alex couldn't see who. He falsified official documents, violated multiple regulations. Those actions cannot be dismissed simply because the outcome was positive. You're absolutely right, the Queen said, and Alex's stomach dropped. Those actions cannot be dismissed. They must be examined, understood, and learned from. She looked at Alex. What you did was illegal under multiple jurisdictions. Violated Terran diplomatic corps regulations, celestial concordance station protocols, and potentially several interstellar trade agreements. Yes, yes, Your Majesty, Alex admitted. And if the outcome had been different, if your alterations had been discovered before supplies were distributed, if the political fallout had damaged diplomatic relationships or caused supply chain disruptions, I would have accepted responsibility and faced consequences, Alex said. I knew what I was risking, but you did it anyway. Yes. Why? Alex took a breath. Because 800,000 people mattered more than my career. Because the rules were wrong and following them meant people died. Because I had the power to help and couldn't live with myself if I didn't use it. The Queen turned back to the assembly. This, she said, is what moral courage looks like. Not political speeches about values, not carefully worded policy statements, but actual choice with actual consequences made by someone who decided that being right mattered more than being safe. One of her own advisors, a younger Velthine whose ears were shifting through multiple positions rapidly, spoke up hesitantly. Your Majesty, I understand your point, but creating a position specifically to reward someone who violated regulations sends a troubling message about the rule of law. Does it? The Queen asked. Or does it send a message about what I value, about the difference between rules that serve justice and rules that serve convenience, about... She turned to Ambassador Chen. The Terran Alliance has a choice. You can prosecute Lieutenant Rivera for his violations, making clear that your government values regulations over results. Or you can recognize that he acted with honor and allow him to accept my offer with your blessing. Choose wisely, Ambassador, because the galaxy is watching how you respond to someone who saved 800,000 lives. Chen looked uncomfortable, caught between regulations and optics, between bureaucratic protocol and the political reality of punishing someone for preventing mass starvation. We will need to discuss this internally, he said finally. Lieutenant Rivera's service record is otherwise exemplary. Given the extraordinary circumstances, I believe we can reach an accommodation that respects both our regulations and the value of what he accomplished. Meaning you'll let him go quietly rather than court-martial him publicly, the Queen said. I suppose that's as much pragmatism as I can expect. Very well. Lieutenant Rivera, you are released from Terran service with honor. Welcome to mine. Alex's head was spinning. Your Majesty, I haven't actually accepted yet. Haven't you? The Queen smiled slightly. You saved 800,000 people at significant personal risk. You walked into this hall not knowing whether you'd be punished or praised. You stood beside me while I publicly condemned the very systems that employ most beings in this room. If you were going to refuse, you would have done so already. She wasn't wrong, Alex realized. Somewhere during her speech, during her fury at systems that valued political convenience over human lives, during her public defense of his choice, he'd made his decision. I accept, Your Majesty, he said formally. I'll serve your government as humanitarian logistics advisor, and I'll do my best to ensure your policies actually help the people they're meant to serve. The Queen's smile widened slightly. Good, then let's begin. Queen Asara gestured to one of her advisors, who approached with a data tablet looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Advisor Kelrin will brief you on the immediate priorities, she said to Alex. But first, I want to address something with this assembly. She turned to face the full hall once more, her expression settling back into that controlled fury that had opened this entire session. I have been ruling for 317 years, she began. In that time, I have negotiated treaties, waged wars, expanded my empire's borders, and presided over periods of both prosperity and crisis. I have made decisions that affected billions of lives. Some of those decisions were correct. Some were mistakes. Some I remain uncertain about to this day. Her ears shifted into a position Alex's database suggested meant uncomfortable honesty. But in all those years, she continued, I have never been as ashamed of my government as I was 3 days ago when I discovered what the Relief Act actually meant. When I understood that I had endorsed policy that would have killed 800,000 civilians through bureaucratic language designed to obscure that reality. Several of her advisors were now staring at the floor, unwilling to meet her gaze. I failed, the Queen said simply. I trusted advisors to protect my moral authority while they protected only my political convenience. I reviewed policy documents without demanding full accounting of their consequences. I allowed diplomatic language to shield me from the brutal truth of what we were actually doing. She gestured at the assembled delegates. And you, all of you, participated in that failure. Representatives who negotiated exclusion provisions, advisors who drafted the language, delegates who voted for the act without questioning what alignment requirements actually meant for real people. A Crithian warlord rose, his storm cloud substance crackling defensively. Your Majesty, with respect, the Relief Act distributed aid to 17 colony worlds. The exclusion of 3 was unfortunate but necessary to secure enough support. Do not, the Queen interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut through the Crithian's rumbling tones. Use the word necessary to describe choosing which civilians deserve to starve. Necessary means unavoidable. What you mean is expedient. You sacrificed 3 worlds because it was politically easier than fighting for them. Politics is the art of the possible, the Crithian replied. We work within constraints, then expand the constraints, the Queen said. Or find new ways to work, or acknowledge that your political systems are failing if they require sacrificing civilians to function. But don't stand in this hall and call mass death necessary, as if that word absolves you of responsibility for the choice. She took a step forward, her fury now fully visible. I am done, she said, with language that obscures reality, with policy that treats lives as negotiable, with government that prioritizes political calculation over the beings we are supposed to serve. She pointed at Alex. This human showed me what I should already have known, that when you have power to help and choose not to use it, you are complicit in the suffering that follows. That rules exist to serve justice, not to excuse inaction. That sometimes the most moral thing you can do is break unjust policy and accept the consequences. Her gaze swept across the entire assembly. How many of you have power right now that you're not using? She asked. How many of you could make choices that would help people but don't because it's politically inconvenient? How many of you hide behind procedure and protocol while people suffer? The silence was damning. I am making changes, Queen Isara announced, to my government immediately. All humanitarian aid policies will be reviewed within 30 days. Any exclusion provisions based on political alignment will be eliminated. Any bureaucratic obstacles that prioritize diplomatic positioning over civilian welfare will be removed. She turned to her advisors. And you will help with this review or you will be replaced. I am done with advisors who protect my political interests at the expense of my moral authority. If you cannot serve both, you will serve neither. Chief Advisor Kelrin had gone very pale. Your Majesty, such sweeping changes will take considerable time and resources. Then start now, the Queen said, and work quickly. I want preliminary reports within 1 week. Full policy review within 30 days. Implementation within 60. This is not negotiable. She looked at Alex. Your first assignment as my humanitarian logistics advisor will be to audit every current aid program and identify similar problems. You will have full access to all relevant databases, full authority to interview staff at any level, and full protection from political retaliation. If you find policy that harms civilians to serve political interests, you will report directly to me, and we will fix it. Yes, Your Majesty, Alex said, his mind already racing through the implications. You will also, the Queen continued, establish protocols to prevent this kind of failure from happening again. I want systems that make it impossible for exclusion provision to be hidden in diplomatic language. I want review processes that force advisors to confront the human cost of policy choices. I want mechanisms that prevent political calculation from overriding moral obligation. She paused. And if those systems require violating some existing procedures or protocols, you have my authority to do so. I would rather have chaos that serves justice than order that produces death. From the assembly, a delegate Alex didn't recognize stood. Your Majesty, you're essentially giving this human carte blanche to override your government's established processes. The potential for abuse is less concerning to me, the Queen interrupted, than the demonstrated reality of what those established processes produced. Lieutenant Rivera risked everything to save 800,000 lives. I trust his judgment more than I trust systems that condemned those people to death. She looked at Alex with an expression that might have been wry amusement. Of course, she said, if you abuse that authority, I will hold you accountable. But somehow I doubt that someone who committed career-ending insubordination to help people he'd never met is going to suddenly become corrupt when given actual power to do the same work legally. I'll do my best not to let you down, Your Majesty, Alex said. See that you don't. I'm taking considerable political risk by elevating you this way. Don't make me regret defending you. The Queen returned to her throne, settling into it with the kind of deliberate authority that signaled the formal portion of her pronouncements was concluding. This session is adjourned, she announced. The Relief Act amendments will be distributed within 48 hours. Any delegate who wishes to object may do so in writing, and I will personally explain to their constituents why political alignment should determine access to food. No one moved to object. Dismissed, the Queen said. The assembly began to disperse, delegates filing out in small groups, many casting looks at Alex that ranged from respect to resentment to frank curiosity about who this human was and why he'd just been elevated to a position of significant authority. Ambassador Chen approached, looking like he was trying to decide whether to be proud or annoyed. Lieutenant Rivera, he said formally, or should I say former Lieutenant Rivera, we need to discuss the terms of your separation from Terran service. I'll submit my resignation immediately, Alex said, effective as soon as administratively possible. That would be appreciated, Chen admitted. Given the circumstances, I think we can process this as a mutually agreed separation for employment with allied government. Your service record will note that you left in good standing. Even though I violated regulations. Even though you saved 800,000 lives, Chen corrected. The Corps is bureaucratic, but we're not heartless. What you did, he paused, choosing words carefully, what you did was both a violation of procedure and a demonstration of the values we're supposed to embody. That's complicated, but I think we can acknowledge both truths. He extended his hand and Alex shook it. For what it's worth, Chen said quietly, I'm proud to have had you serving in my delegation, even if your service is ending this way. What you did took courage, and I hope you'll remember that the Terran Alliance supported you when the consequences arrived. You're letting me leave without court-martial, Alex said. That's more support than I expected. Take the win, Rivera. And good luck with your new position. Something tells me you're going to need it. Chen left, and Alex found himself alone on the dais except for a few of the Queen's remaining advisors, all of whom were studiously avoiding eye contact. Chief Advisor Kelrin finally approached, his ears held in a position that Alex's database identified as professional courtesy masking deep concern. Advisor Rivera, he said, and the title sounded strange coming from someone who'd been serving the Velthine government for probably decades. I've been instructed to brief you on immediate priorities and provide access to all relevant systems. I appreciate that, Chief Advisor. Kelrin's ears twitched. I should be clear, I opposed your appointment. I still believe it's dangerously irregular to create a position specifically to reward someone who violated multiple regulations. That said, Her Majesty has made her decision, and I serve her will. So I will provide you with everything you need to succeed, even if I believe the entire situation is insane. Alex supplied. I was going to say unprecedented, but yes, insane also applies. Kelrin's expression softened slightly. However, I will also admit that you accomplished something I failed to do. You made Her Majesty question whether our systems serve justice. That's valuable, even if the method was irregular. He pulled up data on his tablet. Your first priority is the aid policy audit Her Majesty mentioned. I've prepared a list of all current humanitarian programs, along with relevant policy documents and implementation reports. It's comprehensive, approximately 47 active programs across 14 systems. That's a lot, Alex said. Hence why I suggested the timeline was unrealistic, Kelrin said dryly. But Her Majesty was quite firm about the 30-day deadline, so I suggest you start immediately. He transferred the data to Alex's personal device, or tried to, then frowned. You don't have appropriate access credentials, he said. I'll need to establish you in our systems. That will take several hours of administrative processing. I can wait. You'll also need quarters in the Velthine diplomatic section, security clearances, introduction to key staff members, briefing on our government structure and decision-making processes. Kelrin was listing items now, his ears shifting into what might have been overwhelmed organizational mode. This is going to take days to do properly. Then we should start now, Alex said. Kelrin studied him for a moment. You're serious about this, about taking the position, working in our government, attempting the impossible task Her Majesty has assigned you. 800,000 people are alive because I altered some shipping manifests, Alex said. If I can help prevent similar problems from happening again, if I can make even a small difference in how your government approaches humanitarian work, yes, I'm serious about that. Very serious. Kelrin's ears shifted into a new position that Alex couldn't interpret. Her Majesty was right about you, the chief advisor said quietly. You actually mean it. You're not calculating political advantage or career advancement. You genuinely care about the work itself. Is that so unusual? In these halls, yes, extremely unusual. Kelrin's expression was difficult to read. Most beings who achieve positions of power do so because they want power. You achieved power because you wanted to help people. He paused. That's going to make you either very effective or very frustrating to work with. Possibly both. I'll try for effective, Alex said. See that you do. Come, we have a great deal of work to accomplish, and Her Majesty's 30-day deadline is already starting to feel impossible. They left the Grand Assembly Hall together, and Alex tried to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. He'd walked in expecting punishment for violating regulations. He'd walked out as advisor to one of the most powerful rulers in known space, with a mandate to reform humanitarian policy and authority to override bureaucratic obstacles. His entire life had changed in less than an hour, all because he'd quietly altered some shipping manifests to prevent people from starving, and a queen had been furious, not at him, but at the systems that made his choice necessary. The ceiling of the corridor they walked through looked like standard station architecture, functional, clean, utterly normal. But everything else was different. And Alex, following Chief Advisor Kelrin toward a future he couldn't begin to predict, thought maybe that was exactly how change was supposed to work. Sometimes quietly, through shipping manifest alterations. Sometimes loudly, through public denunciations and governmental reform. But always in service of people who needed help and had no voice to ask for it. The Queen had been furious, and that fury had recognized him instead of destroying him. Now came the hard part, living up to that recognition. 3 weeks later, Alex sat in his new office in the Velthine diplomatic section, a space approximately 3 times larger than his previous quarters, and equipped with systems that could access databases he'd previously needed 5 levels of clearance to view, and stared at the preliminary audit results that Chief Advisor Kelrin had just delivered. "This cannot be accurate," he said. "I assure you it is," Kelrin replied, his ears held in a position that Alex had learned meant professionally neutral while delivering bad news. The data on Alex's screen showed 47 active humanitarian aid programs, as Kelrin had mentioned during their first meeting. 23 of them contained some form of exclusion provision, alignment requirement, or bureaucratic obstacle that prioritized political considerations over civilian need. 23, nearly half. How did this happen? Alex asked. How did we end up with systems that are supposed to help people but actually exclude them based on political classifications? Incrementally, Kelrin said. One small compromise at a time. One reasonable restriction added to secure support from a reluctant ally. One alignment requirement justified as encouraging proper governance. Each individual change seemed minor but accumulated over years. They created systems that harmed the people we're supposed to help, Alex finished. Yes. Alex scrolled through the examples. A medical supply program that excluded colonies without formal defense pacts. A food distribution system that required recipient governments to maintain embassies with major powers. An infrastructure rebuilding initiative that allocated resources based on trade volume rather than need. The medical supply one, he said. How many people does that exclude? Kelrin checked his own data. Approximately 200,000 spread across 7 colony worlds. And the food distribution requirements. Harder to quantify precisely, but our estimates suggest at least 500,000 beings live on worlds that don't maintain the required embassy relationships. Alex felt sick. We're withholding food from 500,000 people because their governments don't have the resources to maintain embassies. The policy was designed to encourage diplomatic engagement, Kelrin said, but his tone suggested he knew how hollow that justification sounded. By threatening starvation, that's not encouragement, that's coercion. I don't disagree, Kelrin said quietly, but these policies didn't appear from nowhere. They were negotiated, debated, approved through proper channels. Multiple advisors reviewed them. I reviewed several myself and signed off on them. He looked directly at Alex. I failed to ask the right questions, failed to consider the human cost, failed to prioritize civilian welfare over diplomatic objectives. Her Majesty's fury was justified. I deserved it. The chief advisor's admission surprised Alex. Over the past 3 weeks, Kelrin had been professional but distant, clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation but determined to fulfill his duty to the Queen. This was the first time he'd acknowledged personal responsibility. We all failed, Kelrin continued. The entire governmental structure failed, and it took someone from outside that structure, someone without our training or political instincts or diplomatic expertise, to see clearly enough to recognize the failure and fix it. He gestured at the data on Alex's screen. So what do you recommend we do about these 23 programs? Alex thought for a moment. The exclusion provisions need to be eliminated, all of them, no exceptions. That will be politically costly. Several of these programs exist because of negotiated agreements with allied powers. Unilaterally changing them could damage those relationships. Then we damage those relationships, Alex said. If our alliances require threatening civilians with starvation to maintain them, they're not worth maintaining. Kelrin's ears shifted into a position that might have been approval. Her Majesty said something similar when I presented preliminary findings to her yesterday. She was quite clear that political convenience would not override humanitarian need, regardless of diplomatic consequences. How angry was she? Alex asked. Furious. Again. possibly more so than during the assembly session because this time the scope of the failure was clear. 23 programs, millions of beings affected. Years of accumulated policy that prioritized everything except the people we're meant to serve. Kelrin pulled up additional data. She's ordered immediate amendments to all 23 programs. The exclusion provisions will be removed within 48 hours. Aid distribution will be based solely on need with no political qualifications. Alex paused, processing. That's exactly what should happen. Yes. It's also going to cause significant disruption to our diplomatic relationships. Several allied powers have already sent strongly worded communications about unilateral policy changes that affect negotiated agreements. Let them complain, Alex said. We're helping people who need help. That's not something to apologize for. Her Majesty agrees. She scheduled meetings with every delegation that objected to explain personally why civilian welfare matters more than diplomatic convenience. Kelrin's ears twitched toward what might have been amusement. I suspect those meetings will be educational for the delegates involved. A chime sounded, Alex's communication device, which had been pinging constantly for 3 weeks with requests for meetings, interviews, policy briefings, and what appeared to be a concerning number of marriage proposals from beings who found his actions romantic. He ignored most of them, focusing only on work-related communications. This one was from Queen Isara herself. Advisor Rivera, attend me in the ceremonial chamber at your earliest convenience. We have matters to discuss. The Queen wants to meet, Alex said to Kelrin. Then you should go. When Her Majesty requests attendance, earliest convenience means immediately if not sooner. Alex stood, grabbing his data tablet. Will you join me? You've been running point on the audit coordination. You should be there for any policy discussions. Kelrin's ears shifted in surprise. You want me present? Your chief advisor. You know how this government works. Understand the political implications. I'm still learning, and you've been invaluable in getting the audit completed on schedule. Of course I want you there. Something in Kelrin's expression shifted, a subtle change but present. I initially opposed your appointment, he said quietly. I thought you were unqualified, irregular, potentially dangerous to proper governmental function. I know. You told me that the first day. I was wrong. Kelrin's ears settled into a position that Alex had learned indicated sincerity. Or not entirely wrong, you are irregular and you do disrupt proper function. But you're also correct about what matters. You ask the right questions, prioritize the right values, refuse to compromise on fundamentals even when compromise would be easier. He gestured at the audit data. I would never have questioned these 23 programs without your work. Would have continued approving policies that harmed civilians because I'd forgotten to ask whether our systems actually serve the people they're meant to protect. You reminded me. Her Majesty reminded me. And I am, he paused, struggling with the words, grateful for that reminder, even though it required public humiliation to deliver it. For what it's worth, Alex said, I don't think you're the villain here. You're someone working within flawed systems who didn't realize how flawed they'd become. That's different from deliberately creating harm. Perhaps. But ignorance of consequences doesn't absolve responsibility for them. I should have known better. Should have asked harder questions. Should have protected Her Majesty's moral authority instead of her political convenience. Then know better now, Alex said. Ask those questions going forward. Help me fix these systems so the next person doesn't have to violate regulations to prevent people from starving. That's more valuable than guilt over past failures. Kelrin's ears shifted into determined resolution. Agreed. Shall we attend Her Majesty? They walked together through the Velthine diplomatic section, corridors that were becoming familiar to Alex, though he still occasionally got lost in the more elaborate ceremonial wings. The ceremonial chamber was smaller than the Grand Assembly Hall, but no less impressive. With walls carved from something that looked like crystallized starlight, and a ceiling that somehow displayed actual constellations despite being inside a space station. Queen Asara was waiting, wearing formal robes but standing rather than seated on the throne that occupied one end of the chamber. "Advisor Rivera, Chief Advisor Kelrin," she greeted. "Thank you for attending." "Your Majesty," they both responded. "I've reviewed the preliminary audit findings," the Queen said without preamble. 23 programs with exclusion provisions, millions of beings affected. Years of accumulated policy that failed its fundamental purpose. Her ears were in that controlled fury position that Alex had learned meant she was angry at systems rather than individuals. "I want to discuss implementation timeline for the amendments," she continued. "Chief Advisor Kelrin suggests 48 hours. Advisor Rivera, do you concur?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The changes are straightforward, removing exclusion language, updating distribution criteria to focus on need rather than alignment. It shouldn't require extensive rewriting. "And the political fallout will be significant," Kelrin said. "We've received formal objections from 7 allied powers, informal complaints from another 12. Several are threatening to reconsider their own humanitarian commitments if we unilaterally alter negotiated agreements." "Let them reconsider," the Queen said. "If their humanitarian commitments are conditional on our willingness to harm civilians, they're not humanitarian at all. They're political theater disguised as aid work." She moved to the chamber's large window, which offered a view of the station's docking area. Dozens of ships from various civilizations, all conducting business on neutral ground. "I received a communication this morning from the Valorian Empire," she said. "Their chancellor expressed deep concern about our policy changes and suggested that unilateral amendments to negotiated agreements demonstrate disregard for diplomatic partnership." "What did you tell him?" Alex asked. "That I have deeper concern about the civilians who would starve under the policies he negotiated, and that any diplomatic partnership requiring such civilian harm is partnership I'm willing to reconsider." The Queen's ears shifted forward slightly. He did not respond well. "Are we risking our alliance with the Valorian Empire?" Kelrin asked, clearly concerned. "Possibly, probably, I don't particularly care." Queen Asara turned to face them directly. "I have been ruling for more than 3 centuries. I have built alliances, negotiated treaties, maintained relationships that benefited my people. Those accomplishments matter and I'm proud of them." Her expression hardened. "But if maintaining those accomplishments requires me to condemn civilians to death through administrative language, then they're not accomplishments at all. They're comfortable lies I've been telling myself about what governance means." She gestured at Alex. "This human showed me that, showed all of us, and I will not go back to comfortable lies simply because facing truth is politically inconvenient." "Your Majesty," Kelrin said carefully, "I support the policy changes entirely, but I worry about the cumulative effect on our diplomatic position. If multiple allied powers reconsider their relationships with us, then we will find new allies," the Queen interrupted. "Or we will stand alone, but we will stand for something worth standing for." She returned to stand before them, her posture shifting into formal pronouncement mode. "I am making an additional announcement," she said. "Effective immediately, all Velthian humanitarian aid programs will be governed by a new principle. Civilian need is the only criterion that matters. Not political alignment, not diplomatic relationships, not strategic value. Only need." "Your Majesty, that's," Kelrin started. "Revolutionary, yes, politically risky, absolutely correct, without question." The Queen's ears were fully forward now. "I'm done governing through comfortable compromises that harm the beings we're supposed to protect. If that makes us unreliable diplomatic partners, so be it. I would rather be unreliable than complicit." She looked at Alex. "This is your doing, you know. Your insubordination started all of this. Are you satisfied with the chaos you've created?" Alex considered how to answer. 3 weeks ago, He'd been a logistics officer trying not to get fired. Now he was advising a queen who was potentially upending decades of diplomatic relationships to prioritize humanitarian values. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "I'm satisfied that people who need help are getting it. If that creates chaos for political systems that were failing them, yes, I'm satisfied with that." The Queen smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Alex had seen from her since the assembly session. "Good answer," she said. "Kelrin, what do you think? Is Advisor Rivera's chaos worth the diplomatic cost?" The chief advisor looked between them, his ears shifting through several positions, before settling on something that might have been reluctant acceptance. "I think," he said slowly, "that we've been prioritizing the wrong things for a very long time, and I think correcting that error is worth whatever diplomatic complications result. So yes, his chaos is worth the cost." "Then we are agreed," Queen Isara said. "The new principle goes into effect immediately. Draft the formal announcement, Chief Advisor. I want it distributed to all diplomatic channels within 12 hours. "Yes, Your Majesty." "And Advisor Rivera, continue your audit work. I want identification of any remaining programs that contain hidden exclusions or political requirements. I want our entire humanitarian system reviewed and corrected. You have 60 days. Understood, Your Majesty." The Queen moved toward the chamber's exit, then paused. "One more thing," she said. "The Terran Alliance has requested a formal meeting. Ambassador Chen wants to discuss the implications of recent policy changes for interspecies humanitarian cooperation." "Do you want me to attend?" Alex asked. "No, I want you to lead it." The Queen's expression was difficult to read. "You started this revolution. You should help explain it to those trying to understand what it means." "Your Majesty, I'm not a diplomat." "No, you're something better. You're someone who actually cares about the work more than the politics. Show Ambassador Chen what that looks like. Maybe he'll learn something." She left, and Alex stood in the ceremonial chamber with Kelrin, trying to process yet another impossible task added to his growing list. "She's serious," Kelrin said. "You'll be leading the meeting with the Terran delegation." "I've never led a diplomatic meeting in my life." "Then you'll learn quickly. That seems to be your pattern, doing things you've never done before and somehow making them work through sheer determination and moral clarity." Kelrin's ears shifted towards something that might have been respect. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you'll do fine. You may not have diplomatic training, but you have something many trained diplomats lack: the ability to speak truth without calculating political advantage. Ambassador Chen will appreciate that, even if it makes him uncomfortable." They left the chamber together, and Alex thought about the meeting ahead, the audit work continuing, the chaos he'd apparently created through one act of quiet insubordination. 800,000 people were alive because he'd altered shipping manifests. Now millions more would receive aid because a queen had been furious enough at her own systems to tear them apart and rebuild them. Was that worth the diplomatic complications, worth the political chaos, worth the risk to established alliances? Alex thought about parents on Veridian 3 who could feed their children now, about medical facilities on New Corsica that had supplies, about infrastructure rebuilding on Haven's Gate that would help refugees build new lives. Yes, it was worth it, all of it. The Queen's fury had recognized him, elevated him, and challenged an entire governmental system to be better than it had been. And Alex, standing in corridors of power he'd never expected to access, carrying authority he'd never sought, working to fix systems he'd broken through insubordination. He was exactly where he needed to be. Some revolutions started with shipping manifests. Some continued with queens who were furious at the right targets, and some changed how empires governed, one policy amendment at a time. The galaxy was watching. The Queen was still furious, and Alex was learning that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was refuse to accept that political necessity excused moral failure. Even if a
Quieto, puto, no me estás picoteando.
Vamos a comprar un agua.
Tyler agradece al señor amable de seguridad con puro balazo para que lo deje entrar de regreso.
Hey.
Superman, güey.
$12 un hot dog, güey, mames. Vamos a dar la vuelta para acá, chicos, madre. Ahorita, verga. Está bien caro, güey. $12, güey. Un hot dog con papas, güey. Chingate esa.
Recuerdo la primera vez que visité Estados Unidos, lo primero que hice fue ir al Dunkin' Donuts, que aunque lo hay en España, no se siente igual, y vi la escena más peliculera, 2 policías comiendo donuts XD, me hizo gracia.
¿Qué se cae? Si andas ahí todavía, mi zona por ahí con los de Invincible. Perdóname, güey. Espera, deja pago por esto. There's the water. Thank you. $5, cabrón. $5 putos, güey. Chipi, chapa, chapa. Ah, la verga, ¿eso es no pedo? Ah, no, es que... Verga, no dije nada, perdón.
Te vas a oxidar, debe ser una cheve para contrarrestar la michelada. La música ellos la escuchan.
Sí, sí, güey.
Nada más fuiste a que te dieran un cogidón con esos precios.
Ya sé, güey. Ay, güey.
Usualmente, ¿cuánto cuesta una agüita?
$3. Pero una grande, güey, está chiquita. Todo lo que avientan, güey, se escucha.
Y ya te alivianaste o sigues jodido.
Ya.
Se me hace que te falta ya comer algo. Qué aburrida, ahí quieta. Yo estaría riéndome y bailando XD.
Pues, ¿qué quieres que te diga? Pues nada, es así, güey. Esto es de Netflix, güey. ¿Vieron la Navi?
Haz por eso lo ponemos down, pa' que suene. ¿Me compras un labubu?
No, no me gustan los labubos. Mira, eso es un VTuber. Hola. Hola, hola. Busquen a alguien con una cicatriz, güey.
Odiala estar ahí aunque yo sería de ir vestido de chandal, no de niño.